Hello. I'm going to begin reading a quote from an article that is central to tonight's conversation. As Hitler rose to power in Nazi Germany, some scholars fled under threat of violence to the US, where they studied the development of fascism. In this work, Adorno and his colleagues identify the early childhood years as being particularly important in the development of fascist desire, as much of personality development happens in childhood. These scholars make the case that authoritarianism comes from the development of a personality that feels powerless and alone, anxious and insecure. Adorno argued that schools are sites of cruelty where micro-fascist socialization begins for very young learners, where essentially, as a young person is robbed of autonomy and rendered powerless, they are being socialized to be prejudicial, resulting in a type of cruelty that is externalized onto the other. Lewis summarizes Adorno's point in listing three interlocking and mutually reinforcing dimensions that work together in cruelty to develop microfascisms in the child, which are manipulativeness, hardness, and coldness. Basically, through a process of hardening, a person develops an apathy toward the suffering of others, experiencing love in relation to abstracted concepts like that of the nation, and in place of empathy, develops a desire to dominate. The point here is that many children are being socialized in spaces where marketization and punishment are central, and that this type of education pervades the child's bounds of autonomy, which can aid the development of the type of cruelty present in authoritarian personalities. Adorno and his colleagues called for teachers to attend to these issues in early childhood specifically, believing that schools are cultivating the development of desire that could either interrupt or aid fascist tendencies in the future. These histories then beg the question: what are the ways that children are experiencing manipulativeness, hardness, and coldness in schools? Is there a harshness about US education? Where could these microfascisms be operative in early childhood education? If fascist genocidal power prohibits tenderness and care, could care be an antidote? These words come from pages 7-8 in the article Mapping American Fascist Tendencies and Pedagogical Responsibility in Early Childhood Education by Dr. Katie Sloan. Now, you might be wondering, why the heck am I talking about fascism and Nazis on a live series about embracing early childhood education and care values as resistance? Well, if you didn't see the connection, let me illuminate the path of my thinking for you. Tonight's value is prioritizing joy, peace, and love as essential to thriving childhoods. And I began with this detailed quote from Katie's brilliant article because I find her analysis especially relevant to understanding why tonight's value is not only essential to thriving childhoods, but to the future of our democracy. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Denisha Jones. I'm a scholar activist, a teacher educator, former teacher educator, true play advocate, and creator of the community Free to Teach Equals Liberated to Learn. We are in week 10 of Embracing Early Childhood Education and Care Values as Resistance, our Wednesday night live series where we dig into 10 professional early childhood education and care values that should be guiding our work with young children, and use a 4-step framework to turn those values into an act of resistance. If you're joining us for the first time, this series is rooted in a special issue of the Global Education Review that I co-edited with Wahel Dwasmuth, titled Navigating an Uncertain Future by Embracing Early Childhood Education and Care Values. And I'm thrilled to share with you that issue 2 is out. Scan the blue QR code to access all the articles in that second issue. So each week we take one of the values, unpack it, and walk through the 4-step framework together, where we name it, audit it, frame it, and advocate for it. If you missed last week's discussion on strengthening collaboration and communication between families and caregivers with the amazing special guest, Keitha Marks, you can watch the recording on my YouTube page. Scan the red QR code to find all the live recordings. So again, tonight's value is prioritizing joy, peace, love, and security as essential to thriving childhoods. When I first wrote my list of 10 values in the call for the special issue on embracing early childhood education and care values to navigate in an uncertain future, I had not read Katie's article on fascist tendencies in early childhood education. However, given the ongoing war in Ukraine and the genocides in Gaza and Sudan, I knew that prioritizing joy, peace, love, and security was an early childhood education and care value that we must use as we continue to navigate a future that will likely include more children suffering and dying because of the actions of adults. But when I read Katie's article, something really clicked. I never really thought about how fascism grows and develops in ordinary citizens. I knew that in addition to the people who openly joined the Nazi Party, there were so many that simply looked the other way. As we have a resurgence of white nationalists and openly fascist followers take to the streets of our nation's capital during America's 250th celebration, I recognize that fascism remains a clear and present danger. But I never really thought about how one becomes a fascist or how schooling during the early years can socialize children into fascism. Another quote from the article is a quote from Lewis describing how cold and cruel educational spaces were central to fascist regimes of the past. He says, indeed, Hitler himself described the ideal fascist education as a harsh one, where weakness must be stamped out in order to produce violent, masterful, dauntless, cruel, younger generations with nothing weak and tender about it. When Katie asked, is there a harshness about US education? I immediately said yes. And when I thought of the ways that children are experiencing manipulativeness, hardness, and coldness, every day children are asked to pledge their allegiance to a country that claims liberty for all, but has a long history of denying liberty to those who inhabited this land first and those they kidnapped and imported to the land to work for free under the most cruel conditions. And now in 15 to 20 states, teachers can lose their job for teaching children about this country's history. So yeah, I think kids are being manipulated in US schools. As for the hardness, many children continue to suffer from harsh discipline policies, including young children. One of the many early childhood advocates I've been fortunate to meet is Peter Rawich. He's a retired early educator who lives in North Carolina and spent the last few years advocating for parental notification before a child under the age of 8 is suspended. He's also been working to end the use of child seclusion and restraints against children under 8. So yeah, I'm going to say some young children are experiencing harshness in schools in the United States of America. And I'll venture to say some kids are also feeling the coldness of educators or school security who engage with them without a trace of emotions and instead act aloof and indifferent to their suffering. And when I thought about her question regarding Where could these fascisms, or the ways in which less perceptible occurrences of fascist thought or desire are operative across people or culture, right? That's microfascism. How do they operate in early childhood education? I thought about the growing use of suspension and expulsion, which I wrote about over 10 years ago with my colleague Diane Levin, so I'm sure it's gotten worse. I thought about the way young children are surveilled and labeled a threat for failure to obey, and how that begins in early childhood. Carla Shalaby calls them the troublemakers. And she argued that they need classrooms to be spaces where freedom is practiced instead of places where freedom is denied and restricted. So, yeah, Katie's article resonated deeply with me, and I connected it back to this value. Because if we're going to resist microfascism in early childhood education and care, then we must prioritize every childhood being filled with joy, peace, love, and security. And look, I know if we had the power to end all wars and feed all children, most of us would snap our fingers in a heartbeat, but we don't have that power. And until those that do value the life of every child as greater than their own, we will continue to live in a world that accepts child death and suffering as an acceptable loss. But we can ensure that the children in our care with us every day, for the 1 or more years we are fortunate to be their educators and caregivers, experience all the joy, peace, love, and security we can provide. And as the world slips further into a new era of global fascism, we can embrace this value as an act of resistance. After I shared Katie's article on social media, she reached out and reminded me that we briefly met at an early childhood conference. I invited her to be a guest on a show that I was hosting at the time called DEY Dialogue, Discussions in Defense of Childhood. You can scan the pink QR code that's at the top of your screen to access the recording from our discussion about her article, and I'm also going to post it in the comments. I think it shows up on my Facebook page, so you might see it there too. All right, I want to pause here and give you a chance to reflect. So we're going to do 2 reflection questions that are going to pop up on the screen for about 60 seconds. So the first one is, how do you practice freedom with the children you teach and care for? And it's still on there? Okay. I'll give it a full minute. All right. And the second question is, what aspects of your teaching and caregiving can serve as an antidote to power and domination? As you take the time to reflect on these questions, I want to share a brief story of how I tried to use my caregiving as an antidote to power and domination. So, 2 years ago, we hosted two sisters from Colombia who were hoping to meet a family that would adopt them, and I believe they have. The youngest girl, Ivy, was playing a game with my two kids who are older and her older sister. If you lost the game, you were supposed to eat a jelly bean that had a disgusting flavor. And she lost, and they all tried to pressure her to eat the jelly bean, but she refused. And she got really sad and went into her room to cry. So I followed her, and while she was crying, I told her how proud of her I was. And she looked at me a bit surprised, as she thought I would be mad that she didn't play by the rules she agreed to. But I told her that I was immensely proud of her. I told her that it took strength and courage to say no when she was being pressured by people older than her to do something she didn't want to do. I told her under no circumstances should she ever put anything in her mouth because other people told her to do it. She was old enough to say no, and she should always say no if that is how she feels. She should resist any attempts by others to dominate her and make her do something she knows deep down she doesn't want to do. I then gave her a big hug. I hope she never forgets that moment. I hope she remembers that being brave is the antidote to power and domination, and that her agency and autonomy are her greatest weapons. All right, now we're going to talk about how we advocate for this value. So let's apply the four-part framework to this value. The first step is to name your value. What do you believe all children need? What guides your moral commitments to high quality early childhood education and care? Prioritizing children's right to joy, peace, love, and security over mandates and policies that seek to deprioritize these necessities is part of my moral commitment and what I believe is required for every child to have a high quality early childhood education and care. Step 2 is to conduct an alignment audit. What policies prohibit you from enacting this value? What behaviors show you're out of alignment? What is an early warning sign that you are drifting? I think childism is the biggest threat to this value. Childism is prejudice, discrimination, or systemic bias against children based on the adult-centric assumption that adults are superior. Many of you might not recognize how childism operates, but just think about how many people view children as the property of their parents. And often children have very few rights. This stems from a society that devalues children until they are adults who can pay taxes. I think an early warning sign of when someone is not aligned with this value is how quickly they are willing to justify treating a child harshly. When I tell you that 6-year-olds are being handcuffed and placed in seclusion or isolation rooms in schools, and your first response is, well, they must have done something terrible or bad enough to deserve it, you're not aligned with this value. You have been socialized to believe that children deserve to be imprisoned based on their behaviors when they are still developing and not old enough to have complete control of their abilities to reason and control their impulses. And that socialization means you're not aligned with this value. Third, frame the message. Why does this value matter? This is your elevator speech. Here's mine. Children deserve a childhood where thriving is the norm. What does it mean for young children to thrive in school? Failure to thrive is a medical term that means a child does not gain weight at a rate similar to other children of the same age. However, thriving is more than just physical growth and maturation. We must consider thriving in all areas of development: physical, social, emotional, intellectual, and moral. If we are to focus on thriving as the best outcome of a good childhood, then we must return to the basics. And I don't mean the traditional basics that emphasize curricular knowledge in reading and writing and arithmetic, but the basics of what we know about child development. And what we know is that joy, peace, love, and security are essential for optimal child development. And finally, the fourth step is to advocate for your value. How can you advocate for this value in your personal and professional life? I advocate for this value by uplifting children whose childhoods are threatened by war, genocide, famine, displacement, neglect, and abuse. I share how we have a responsibility to work for thriving childhoods for all children. I promote play as the antidote to global forces that seek to threaten childhood and as a tool for fostering resilience and healing. So, tonight's value is prioritizing peace, love, joy, and security as essential to thriving childhoods. I hope that by advocating for all children to have a thriving childhood, you do your part to resist the spread of micro-fascism tendencies in early childhood. I hope you make school less hard and less cold and free of manipulation. If this conversation spoke to you, sparked an interest, you want to talk more, I invite you to join my community, Free to Teach equals Liberated to Learn, now on Patreon. You can scan the green QR code for a free to join for free. And now here's a sneak peek at next week's live show on early childhood education and care value 10, leveraging nature as an ideal environment for fostering development and growth. Hello. Next week, I'm hosting my final live discussion in my Embracing Early Childhood Education and Care Values as Resistance live series. On Wednesday, August 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, I will discuss Early Childhood Education and Care Value number 10, leveraging nature as an ideal environment for early learning and growth. And I'm thrilled to be joined by special guest Tiffany Pearsall. Tiffany is the founder and preschool teacher at Play Frontier in Carson, Washington. I was fortunate to visit Tiffany's preschool while I was on the West Coast a few weeks ago, and it blew me away. I liked it so much that I redid the graphics that I create for each value using all images from Play Frontier. It really is a magical space for children to play in nature. Please join me and Tiffany for this important discussion for how you can embrace this value as an act of resistance. All right, and as I mentioned, next week is the last week. So it's been 11 weeks. There were 10 values, plus I did an intro week. So week 11 is next week. So I'm going to do my best to go out with a bang. Thank you all for all that you do to protect childhood and care for children. And I'll see you next week.